My name is Brandon Diet, Senior Manager of Culture, Sports Performance, and Marketing here at USA Fencing. This is our fifth session of the Engaging Our Community series. And today's conversation will be around creating a diverse and inclusive environment. And we will be led by Ms. Nitra Rucker. Nitra is currently the Director of Diversity for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Prior to this, she spent 20 years at Key Corp, and under her leadership at Key Corp, was named the 2020 National Diversity Council's top company for employee resource groups. Now at the USOPC, Ms. Rucker is responsible for leading, developing, and executing diversity and inclusion strategies. So Nitra, thank you again for joining us. And before I kick it over to Nitra, I just want to say that today's session is going to be a little different, or we're going to try to do it a little differently than we have done in the past. Previously, we had done presentations, we've done a panel and the like. And so today we would like to have an open conversation of sorts. So if you do have questions throughout this conversation, throughout this time together, please feel free to throw them in the chat function. However, if there are any questions that you feel more comfortable being anonymous, but still want to ask those questions and put them out, please do feel free to send them to me directly, and I will send them out to the group anonymously. So with that being said, Nitra, I am going to turn it over to you. And I know you have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to go ahead and get this bad boy fired up for you.
Okay.
Then we should go.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you. And there's some very familiar faces on this call because USA Fencing has been extremely welcoming to me. So in addition to Brandon, I see Peter, I see Nzinga, I see Bob Bodor. There's just several people on the call. Bridget, I think, is on the call, and everyone has been really helpful. So I wanted to say thank you for reaching out, for being welcoming and having me in this space. Before I got here, I had several opportunities to create inclusive environments. And so I'm excited about the opportunity to have this conversation today. But I do want to echo what Brandon said. If you all have questions, please put them in the chat. This is, we want to create an environment for learning. So if we can do that, it would be really helpful if we know what you all want to talk about. So Brandon, I don't know if you can put this in presentation mode and go to the next slide or not, if that's an opportunity.
I'm a little nervous.
That's okay. We'll get through it together.
You can go to by the Zoom on the bottom right, that little next to the book, to the right of the book, on like the bottom panel. Yeah, that.
Yeah, sometimes, I know last time we did this, we had some issues. Can you see?
We can. Before you click forward, Brandon, I just want to ask everybody, you can hit the first click. But I just wanted to ask you all if you can participate with me in this conversation. What are your expectations of today's conversation? What things do you want to get out of this conversation? Because we want to make sure that it's not about me, right? It's about you all. So is there anything in particular that you all want to get out of the conversation? I would really appreciate learning and knowing more about that. So just please drop those things in the chat. That would be helpful. Actionable items for change. Thank you. That's a really good one. Anyone else have expectations? I think we'll give you some actionable items going through this. Any other expectations? Well, while we wait for some other responses, some expectations I have of the group is that we respect everyone. This is going to be a conversation where we want to make sure everyone everyone's voice is welcome. So more than welcome to ask your question, put in the chat, as Brandon said, or ask him in confidence. But we also want everyone to participate so that we can have a robust conversation and an interesting conversation. The more voices, the more interesting it becomes. We also want to listen to each other so that we can learn new things and understand, and then show courage. You know, sometimes it is hard in these conversations to ask questions or to even insert opinions, but guess what? While I might be the director of USOPC, I'm still learning, and I'm more than willing to hear different opinions, and people on this call have already offered me different ways to view things, so I appreciate that. So hopefully through all of that, we'll learn and have a little fun along the way. So I think there was another comment here. How can change be made or implemented? So everybody's looking for change. That's good. I think we're doing some good things, and we'll talk about how to make some of those changes occur. So with that, Brandon, can you go to the next slide, please? First thing we want to talk about is is the agenda. And one of the things that you have to start with is your personal and professional introspection, right? We all have to do a personal inventory on who we are and our outlook and our views. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. We'll talk a little bit about commitment, because change, people keep saying change and what we can do differently. But in order to do that, we have to commit to change. And what I love about being in the world of sport is I think people understand and get that, especially as athletes or people who are servicing or helping athletes perform. If they're not committed, no change occurs, right? But in order to get better, we have to commit to that, to an action or to some change. And then we'll talk about how to have some of these tough conversations. And I really want you all to lean in, ask questions, and provide suggestions when we get to that particular section. So on the next slide, it takes 0.1 to 30. Can you click, Brandon? Seconds. That's how long it takes for people to form an opinion. And it's 0.1 to 30 because there's a lot of research out there. The one piece of research that I like to really reference is it takes 7 seconds to form like 11,000 impressions. So when we meet someone for the first time, we are sizing up a lot of different things. And what we tend to size up is how educated we think they are, how friendly we think they are, how attractive we think they are, and if we think they can be a friend. That's one of the characteristics we size up in less than 30 seconds. Wait, Brandon, let me go back just a second. And I just want us to sit with that thought for a second. So not only do we do it, but people do it to us. So think about how that feels when you go out and if people are sizing you up. One of the pieces of research says that, you know, if you're walking around in your sweats, people think you're uneducated. And guess what? A lot of us do walk around in our relaxed wear, right? What do they call it? Athleisure. So people are sizing us up for no reason other than what we have on. And of course, the color of our skin, our height, our weight, if we have on any religious garb. There's a lot of things that people talk about or people do in an instant second. And that is what not only we have to think about how we do it, but how it impacts who we are and how we present ourselves. So for example, when I show up or when you see me on this camera, a lot of you didn't know me, but the first thing you see is me sitting here in this chair against these curtains. I can't stand these curtains. I don't know what your impression is of them, but I wouldn't necessarily love me because of my curtain, but there may be other characteristics you're looking at, right? My hair, my color, my weight. I don't know what your impressions are, but the thing is, you have to push past those things. And one of the ways we can do that, we can talk about some of those ways, but we have to challenge our biases. And I saw somebody put in the chat that they're reading The Blind Spot. That's an excellent book. But we have to challenge our biases in order to mitigate them. So just think about 1 to 30 seconds. and try to make sure that as we are going through, or as even going through life, you're thinking through, what about this person do I love? What do I not like, and why? Challenge yourself to the why, right? Thank you. Brandon, can you go to the next slide? So here's where we're going to have a little fun. We talk about biases, and you're probably like, why does she have the Dalmatians up here? But if Brandon, hopefully we can play this clip, and I will tell you why in just a second.
Unusual breed. Very unusual. Oh, surely not. Well, now, what have we here? Well, a little too short couple. Nope. I say. Oh, well, I do say. Now, there's a fancy breed. Perhaps a little too fancy. Yes, it's much too fancy. Too old, too young. It was a problem, a real problem. Well, now that's a bit more like it. The most beautiful creature on four legs. Oh, now, if only the girl. Well, she's very lovely, too. It was almost too good to be true. I'd never find another pair like that, not if I looked for 100 years. Ah, you're heading for the park. A perfect meeting place. I can only arrange it.
Thank you. So tell me, what did you see? What did you notice?
Lots of first impressions being made in a very short period of time.
What else? Thank you, Bob.
The instant attraction of somebody that looks like you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bridget. Anything else?
There's a couple in the chat. That's one, snap judgment based on looks, and predetermination and judgment on appearance.
So thank you. We could probably have a whole class or whole learning just about this clip. But the interesting piece of all of what you're saying is true. It shows a lot of bias. It shows how quickly and instantaneously dogs apparently size us up. But here's the interesting thing. I'll bring another piece into it. Do you know 67% of people go and look for pets that look like them? There have been a lot of studies around this. And so you can Google it. There are several studies. And one of the studies they say is people look for pets that have the same kind of eye structure. And then if women have long hair, they look for floppy-eared dogs. Like, it is amazing how people look for things, people, constructs that make them comfortable, right? And how much more do we have to be careful of that if we are doing this at such an instinctual level that we're trying to make everything around us look like us, be like us, that we have to be intentional about coming outside of our comfort zone. Look at your friend groups, look where you do business, look at the activities you engage in. How diverse are they? How different are they from you? That's a hard question. It's hard to go into places where we're not the majority, and that's every one of us, right? It's hard to be the only, but often, a lot of times, Black people, especially in a professional environment, Black people or people of color or people who are LGBTQ or people who have with disabilities, they're often the only. So imagine how you feel if you're the only and you're looking for comfort, and then there's others around you who are already comfortable and they're still seeking comfort. What does that create? Anybody? Any thoughts? Othering. Thank you, Peter.
I would say that it takes a need for translation. And I say this as being the only Jew at my own fencing club where I own the place, that I frequently find myself translating, not literally, into somebody else's cultural language.
Thank you. Absolutely. The translation, the explaining, the building the bridge often falls on the person or persons who are of the minority group. That is tough. And that's hard. And it's, guess what? There's a whole study too on the mental fatigue that causes. There's a lot of mental fatigue that comes in with that. And so not only are these particular individuals having to deal with the pressures of the work, pressures of family, but also of translating, as Sarah said. How much more work can they be? How much more productive can they be and happy if they didn't have to worry about those things, right? So we need to think through how we're creating. I just want to bring up, we all have a lot of biases, all of us, but we have to be aware of them. So one of the actionable, if you want to think about actionable items, somebody put the book, The Blind Spot, in here. I think you should do things like that, read books, and we'll talk about that later. But also there are some tests you can take, implicit bias tests that you can take online, and they're called IAT tests. Google them. Before you take them, read the information. And the reason I say that is because you don't want to just take them unaware, and you don't want to take them if you're not ready. But there are opportunities for you to see which groups, some of the groups you may have bias against, things like that. So it will help you understand and bring awareness to, hey, I need to be more intentional when I'm dealing with this group of people around how I deal with them, the things I say. Am I being inclusive? Am I reaching out? Am I being welcoming? Questions, thoughts? All right. So talk about, how do we create an inclusive environment? There are three major things that we need in order to create. And let's just make sure we're clear here. This is a very short conversation, so I don't want to act like this is all that you have to do, but this is a very high level summary. And we could spend time on all these things. But you have to commit as an organization, a person, and you can put this on whichever level you want, personally, organizationally, as a society, right? We have to commit to doing some things differently. We have to listen. And you all have put in the chat several times, what can we do? We all have to act. When we talk about commitment, I have here leadership, leaders, and learners. When I say leadership, every one of us is a leader, right? At some level, we're leading something and have influence over something or someone. So, but this, when I'm saying leadership, I'm specifically talking about those who have organizational leadership over whatever, whether it's an organization, a company, club, whatever. They have to be committed, because as we know, culture starts at the top. And then when I say leaders, what I'm talking about there are decision makers, right? So these are the people, let's talk about coaches or middle managers or people who actually have the opportunity to move the needle a lot of times. Whether that's, I know a lot of people jump to hiring, but it's also things like promotions. It's who gets on special teams, who am I mentoring, whose name am I putting out there in the stratosphere for opportunity. And then learners, that's everyone. That's everyone. They have to be committed. We all have to be committed to this work, or else it's not going to move forward. Then we have to listen, and listen for very specific things: learning, understanding, and able to identify solutions. So when we start to try to create an inclusive environment, we have to first figure out what's going on with the environment. What things are we doing really well? And what things can we improve? Where are the opportunities? The only way to do that is have very real conversations, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we have to make sure that we are documenting those things so that we can go back and track them and things like that. But then we also have to make sure that we're listening to understand, not to defend, but to understand, right? So it's oftentimes when people say, you know, I didn't feel included. I'll give you an example. I had a manager one time. I was in a cube environment and the manager came in every day and passed my cube. And there was someone who sat behind me and they would say, "Hi, Victor." I was sitting right there and they never spoke to me. So I said, I'm going to test this. And I started standing, like I hear them come through the door. So I started standing up just to see what would happen. And they would just say, "Hi, Victor." I was like, okay, what's going on here? So ultimately, I started saying, "Hey, hi," you know, so that they would see me. And one day he said, "Oh, Nitra, I didn't realize you were in this early as well," because of the way the cube environment was. And I'm like, some days I'm standing up, so I don't know why you don't see me. But I guess they're just so focused, they were going, and they didn't know that I got in early. I'm here too. So sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional, but you have to figure it out. But I had to let them know. I said, you know, that really made me feel excluded. I didn't know why you weren't talking to me. Having that conversation brought an awareness to him. It was kind of funny because I'm like, you know, but at the same time, I would have never known that he was just kind of on autopilot and not understanding I was sitting there. So the next thing you have to do is act. Put together a plan. Once you learn these things and know, so after the manager knew that I was sitting there every morning, did he say, "Hi, Nitra"? Yes, he did. He started speaking to me, which was wonderful. But you have to strategize, put together a plan, and you have to go forward, right? And make sure you have measurable goals that are timely, reasonable. I think I don't know if everyone is aware, but there's what they call the STAR method of goal setting, so that you make sure it's a specific goal, something that has a time restriction to it, it's reasonable and attainable. You can go out and Google that as well. But then you have to measure and report. How did we do? Did you speak to me 4 days or 5 days or only 2 days out the week? So you have to measure those things and see how are we doing and be held accountable to those things. And then you have to improve and repeat. It's simple. And while these things seem simple, there's a lot of meat behind each step, right? It is not this easy, but it can be if it's a part of our organizational structure. Questions, thoughts? Okay. So
I have a question.
Sure.
When you're in a leadership role and it's people underneath you treating you differently, like in your example, what is the best way to call attention? Is it the same or is it different when you're the one who has power in a structural sense?
So when you're a leader, and I'm not sure what the exact scenario is, when you have power, you have to also have grace.
Well, I'll give a specific example because that's probably helpful. So I coach men and women, and I have assistant coaches who are men, and there's been times when I'll have a male athlete on my team after a team dinner or something like that thank the assistant coaches and not me, but I'm the head coach.
Yeah, that stings for sure. I think there's a couple things I would say in instances like that. One, when you do have power, you do have to have grace. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, you can't, it seems retaliatory if you're trying to go after people and say, "Oh, well, you need to say something to me," or whatever. But there are ways where you can express, I think, especially to your leadership team, to say, "Hey, I feel a certain way when this happens. this is where your leaders need to step up and be allies and say, you know, Daria was great as well and helped in this effort, you know, that type of thing. So build an allyship. The other thing is, those are just tough situations because it's hard when you have power. People will sometimes can misconstrue you speaking up and saying things as if you have, let's just be honest, like an ego issue, but it's not. It's the fact that you are the head coach and you helped. And so you have to be, it's a very tight line with things like that, but people need to understand how they oftentimes marginalize people. And so even having that conversation with even the team to say, hey, just want to, you know, talk about some of the things and dynamics within the team, you know, and this is where you have to show vulnerability. As the head coach, sometimes I feel a certain type of way, and here's why. Help me understand. Because they may not even realize they're doing it. Any other questions or thought? Daria, was that helpful? Am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, you are. And yes, it was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I do have a couple examples just so that we can get kind of what this looks like. So if we say we're committed to a more inclusive and engaged workforce, the next thing we can do is say, one of the decisions that may come out of it is give whatever groups more voice in decision making, right? Let's say athletes in this particular case. Let's give them more voice and then increase that representation and engagement on task force, special teams, whatever it is. Or it could be we need more voice in decision making from women or from Blacks or people with disability. Whatever it is, you know, this insert here and then act on it and provide them that opportunity, that representation. Next. I just had another example here just in case, you know, just always good to mix it up a little bit. So what if the commitment is more diverse membership? So now it's greater information needs, maybe we listened and it was greater information needs to be shared within diverse communities. Well, then create some type of community recruiting strategy, right? And engage people to help with whatever communities those may be that you're looking to engage. So those are my two examples. Any other questions here before we talk about having these conversations? All right, Brandon, we can go to the next slide. So one of the things about having tough conversations is they're tough. And just by the nature of us calling them tough, we have a thought on how they're going to go down, right? And oftentimes we think of this first picture, which is what? Contentious. What other thing, what feelings does this kind of thing bring up? When you think about a tough conversation, what are your thoughts? You can share in the chat or you can take yourself off mute. Hesitation, that's a good one. I'll share with you what I often hear, and I'll share from a couple different views. Being in this seat, people tell me a lot. They're not fun, but they're necessary to get change, absolutely. I've heard people say often, so from people who feel marginalized, whether that's Black people, people with disabilities, the conversations are tough because they're tired of having them. They're like, oh, I'm so tired. I don't understand why people don't get it, whatever their it is, right? And then I often hear from people who are of the majority group, whether that is white people, able-bodied people, whatever, it is, I don't want to say something wrong. They oftentimes don't want to say the wrong thing. So can you go to the next, can you just click it again, please, Brandon? And so we have to reframe our thinking. Tough conversations are tough, but they're also necessary to change our dynamic and to understand and help people, help us all learn. So it can help us be heard. It can also help us learn. And I know those things are, Peter is saying, put yourself in another person's skin. It is absolutely an opportunity to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand their viewpoint. So we just have to reframe our thinking. I love the fact that we're in the athlete community because empathy, yes, we're in the athlete community because we have to stretch ourselves, right? I don't know yet a sport that I've come up to that doesn't have to stretch, and I might get there one day, I don't know. But one of the things that I've heard a million trainers say, but if you don't stretch, if there's not some discomfort, you're not going to get better. There has to be discomfort in order for growth. And it's the same thing with tough conversations. We have to have some discomfort in order for learning, for growth, and for action to occur. Because if we never say, hey, we think you should do this differently or better, then we'll never get there. Okay? Thoughts, questions? Okay, let's go to the next slide. I do want to come back to that whole thought on empathy, though. I think that's a very profound point. So this is, I love this picture. It's a meme that's going around online for a long time. But tell me what you see in the picture that's on the left.
The two people looking at a circumstance from a different angle.
Absolutely. Anyone else? So it's not only two people, but there's no right or wrong answer here. It's all about perspective. Thank you, Julie. There's no right or wrong answer. And so the interesting thing is that a lot of people, there are chat rooms online about this picture because people are like, well, if you scroll out, there might be a driveway and it'll show you which direction is correct. And I mean, there's a million different comments. The point of it is perspective is everything, and we all have one. And it's amazing that humans, some of us, I will put myself in that category, come at life as if I was born in Dayton, Ohio. Everybody should think like me. No, everybody shouldn't think like me. I was born in a small city in America, in Ohio, and on a street, right? My street was my world. Why would everybody think like me? Why would everybody have the same perspective? And why do I expect them to? At some point in my life, I had to realize that's not what it is. And and you have to understand to try to see someone else's perspective. And I'll give you another personal story, which I often find empathy is key. I often find funny. So one of my very early diversity lessons in business was I started an internship right after high school. I went into an internship and it was with General Motors and it was in an engine plant. And I was working in their payroll department. So I show up the first day, I was 17, young Black lady, I was still Black then. So show up to this engine plant, go into this office, and there were 5, what at the time to me was probably my age now, but what looked like to me were older white men, right? So I went through the day, did my work, and then I came home and I called my father. And before I couldn't even say anything. My dad said, "You can't quit that job." And I said, "But Dad," he said, "You can't quit that job." I said, "Dad, it was 5 older white men." I said, "They were talking about hunting and killing their lunch. They were talking about harvesting their corn." I said, I don't know what, I don't know. No, I'm not. I want to be with my friends who were working at McDonald's and they were having fun. He said, Nitra, go back in there and figure out what you all have in common. And when I tell you, I had the best summer of my life. By the end of the summer, they had a radio station, a radio playing. Yeah, back then, no iPods and things, but their radio station, we would change it. Some days I get to listen to the music I prefer, and some days, and they would tease me all day. And then at the end, they invited me to their cookout. So I got to go to their family cookout where everybody brought their families, and I had venison for the first time. I did not love it, but I had it. But if I had given up, if my dad hadn't pushed me to connect, they became mentors and I stayed with them for 3 summers. But it was a push. It wasn't easy. And what research will show is creating relationship takes at least 50 hours. But we're in such an instantaneous society, we think if we don't click right away, then there's nothing, there's no friendship there. So we have to be careful of how we come into the conversation. We have to be careful to make sure we see other people's perspective. And then I want to go back to the empathy comment. Who was making the comment around empathy? I don't know who it was in the chat. But if you, Lily? Oh, Sarah. Sarah, can you say more about empathy and how you feel it is so important?
There I am. My students will tell you, especially like my 12 and unders, my favorite word in the world is empathy, because empathy allows you to try and see through somebody else's shoes. The big thing for me when I was a kid was this whole, I think it was the native proverb, don't judge a person until you've walked a mile in their moccasins. I know that was big on like TV for stuff that they showed like Saturday morning type thing. And that also, it struck a nerve for me. But what empathy does is it kind of lets you take off your own personal clothing and try on somebody else's from a different perspective. I think for me, I was lucky enough to grow up in a suburb that prided itself and made national news multiple times for the diversity that we did in Cleveland.
Cleveland where?
Shaker Heights.
Shaker, I'm in Cleveland. I'm in Maple. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
We'll talk about it later.
Sounds good. But I think empathy is the key to getting past somebody's clothing that you disagree with or don't understand or don't like or aren't comfortable with.
Well said. Very well said. Anyone else want to chime in on the empathy conversation on either how you get there or how it's been helpful?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think empathy is also a direct result of education and life experience. I think it's, empathy is more challenging for somebody that just grows up in a very, isolated or, homogeneous environment. And, I think it's why people feel like travel is important, why people feel it's important to live in different areas, and education. So I totally agree with what Sarah said about empathy and you as well, Nitra, but I think it's sometimes harder to accomplish than it might appear, just because of limitations, like I mentioned.
That's true. And does anyone else want to chime in on that? I see a couple comments in the chat. Anyone else?
Nitra, one thing that I've always kind of thought, well, in the last few years, is I felt at times that people who cannot empathize no longer care to sympathize. Mm-hmm. And I felt that was a lot of where disconnects have come in our society as individuals.
That's a whole conversation, Brandon. I think you're right. I think so. There have been one of the interesting pieces or factoids. I like to read a lot of different articles and studies. And one of the studies that they found was around how much we socialize now versus before social media was out there. And socialization for younger generations has gone down. They don't socialize as much because they want to have the perfect place setting, the perfect home look so that you can post Instagram or TikTok video or whatever the picture is. And it speaks to our lack of ability to connect and empathize and really sympathize with if people don't like me because they don't hit the like button, or they don't connect with me because my stuff isn't as good or whatever. But there is an emotional connection that we need to get back to around just who we are as people versus what it looks like our lives are, right? And you're right. I think when people can't empathize, they can't really understand why whatever the situation or issue is hurts you. And that is problematic. And I think we all have to do better in that instance. For example, sometimes people can't get to a place because they don't have transportation. You know, I'm not sure who on the call what forms of transportation we all have, but that can sometimes be an issue for people. That's very telling around if they're able to get to different venues or exposure to different opportunities. It's hard. So empathy, sympathy, all the things that go into it, and how we create a view of a person is critical and essential. How we can help other people get there, that there is a lot of training around when people make very pointed comments about different groups. For example, how to insert empathetic comments around, well, why do you think that is? Or how do you think that impacts them? Or do you think that that's their goal in life? That type of thing. Because we have to be more empathetic. We have to be more and sympathetic as well. So that's a whole study. Go ahead.
The things I see getting in the way of people's empathy often are when they feel very justified or self-righteous in their view, but also fear or anxiety around what it might mean to step into someone else's shoes and try to see it from their angle, that they might find themselves in the wrong or to blame. That was a thought that came up for me.
That's a great thought. The interesting thing about empathy or what you just said is a lot of isms, whether it's racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, xenophobia, whatever those things are, they're very big concepts. They're very macro societal issues. They're delivered in a very micro way. The decisions I make could be all of those isms, right? So I have to look at myself. So just to your point, it is a very personal thing to finally say to yourself, guess what? I may have been treating somebody or some group in a particular way that was wrong. It's hard.
Yeah.
I think the next question is, though, how do we move forward? Right? And that's something that everybody has to deal with themselves. But I just like going back to like Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's why they put that step in there about reconciliation, right? Going back and making amends. And I know a lot of times we can't always go back. However, we have to forgive ourselves, try to forgive others for things and offenses, or even the teachings that sometimes we've been taught all of our lives. So it's going to take a lot to get there. Brandon, did you have something to say?
Well, there was a question in the chat. Do you think start with benevolence is a good way to lead us towards empathy?
I think it's start with curiosity. And I do think benevolence is a part of it, because I do think we have to be more willing. There's a quote I have at the end of this that I think speaks exactly to your point. But yes, I do think we have to be more giving in our forgiveness, or our willingness to let people move on, or our willingness to let people change, if that makes sense. Absolutely. Because if we don't allow people to change, we will still be where we are. And so, to Daria's point, once somebody realizes that I've not been empathetic, now what? Now, if I try to change, will you let me or no? And that is where benevolence comes in. We can go to the next slide. Any other comments or thoughts?
Well, I think that's a good transition even to this tough conversations, is because I think even from the let's call it the minority perspective, and those who feel tired about having those conversations, but their role in these tough conversations and in general, you know, allowing time for change, and allowing people to make missteps along the path of making that change.
That's tough. That's tough. That's tough. It is, because especially when you feel you've been wrong. So it's hard, and we all have a place in this, and we all have work to do. And to your point, that's a great transition. So how do we have these tough conversations? The first thing I have here is understand the conversation's goals. And whoever is creating or putting these things together, you have to, what do you want out of it? What is the ultimate end goal? And this has to be defined, because a lot of times when we're having these, and really this is constructed at a group level, but this can be personal as well. When you're going to a friend, or you're going to somebody to say, hey, what are you expecting out of this conversation? So I think laying that groundwork and foundation is critical to having these conversations. And then the second bullet is bring in a professional to help construct and facilitate. I do suggest that for different conversations, if you're having especially racial conversations, or conversations about race, or conversations about other isms. And I'll say this for this reason. When we have these tough, like, town halls and different conversations, and we're asking minorities, Black people, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, whomever, to share their stories, that's traumatic. That can be very traumatic. And so we don't, as a society, view it as the same type of trauma, but when we have victims of crime, we don't ask them to relive it, right? And it's the same thing when people have gone through life traumas that marginalize them, or minimize them, or say that they don't belong or shouldn't be here. So when you're having these conversations, you have to be very careful, because it's traumatic, and you don't want to leave people out there in their trauma. You want to have somebody who is trained in picking them up and moving them forward. And I think whenever you host conversations like that, safety, right? Psychological safety is paramount. So that's why I suggest bringing in a professional. Construct the conversation to facilitate it. Outline the structure, the ground rules, what people will be held accountable to, and stick with those, whatever those ground rules are. And I say that because you don't want to creep into other conversations. Make sure you're supportive during the conversation. Once again, it can be very hard for people to be vulnerable during those conversations. But then also, I do think there is a call for vulnerability on all sides. Like, whenever you have these conversations, you can't only anticipate or expect that one group is going to provide their stories. For example, you can't always think that the Black people are going to only share their story. Other people have to share their stories as well, on going back to the point of maybe some things that they've done to contribute, or they have to share how they have, had those vulnerable moments, or else it's very lopsided conversation. And once again, going back to that people won't feel supported. So it has to be an even and balanced conversation. And then follow up with any necessary support or resources. Bye, Anna Maria. Anyone else have any thoughts, comments, questions? So this was the comment I was talking about. I was watching John Lewis, Good Trouble, and one of the people in it, Bernard Lafayette, who was a civil rights leader, one of the people who were leading during that particular era, he had a quote in there, and he said, we protested, and he was talking about when they started the sit-ins at the counters. He said, we protested because we had changed. He said, through all of their conversations and things, they had changed. He said, we continue to give them, meaning other people, white people, anyone, the opportunity to also change because we believed it was possible. So it wasn't that they didn't think people were going to change, they just wanted to give them the opportunity to change. And I thought that was very profound. The next quote was from Amanda Gorman, who, her poem, The Hill We Climb, for there's always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So we have to be brave enough to be the light. And Peter, I think you made a comment around coaches. Have to believe they themselves can change. You're right. The coaches, everyone has to believe we all can change. We all can learn. We all can change. We can do things differently and better. We all can. And that's the challenge for ourselves today. So with that being said, what other questions do you have? And I want to make sure, do you all feel that you have things that you can go away from this conversation with, especially since you were looking for action items?
Don't see any questions coming in. I know we're about 5 minutes out. So before I'll kind of switch it back over to Q&A, but I know a lot of people have to hop off at the top of the hour. So Nitra, I want to say thank you again. This is the third time I believe we formally interacted with USA Fencing, and every time we learn something new. So I definitely want to thank you. And you know, the USOPC and the movement is in good hands with you around, and I truly believe that.
Thank you.
And I also just want to let everyone know real quick that we do have one more session in this Engaging Our Community series. There is a time change. It is at 3 p.m. Eastern, which is a little different than the 1 p.m. Eastern that we've been doing traditionally. And it's based around how to be an ally with Chief Catalyst and founder of the Equity Project, Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler. So that is next week at 3 p.m. Eastern. So thank you for all who have to hop off. I appreciate all of you guys for being involved.